What's up, U.S. history? Welcome back. We are on week 5 of distance learning. So far, you guys, most of y'all have done a really good job keeping up with your assignments. So keep up with the good work as far as that goes. Um, the bad news, or I won't even call it bad news, but we're running out of time. We got a short window of classes left, and we got a whole lot of history to cover, which means instead of progressing piece by piece, we're going to cover this thing era by era, or really like decade by decade. So today we're talking the Nixon era. We're going to talk about Richard Nixon himself, and then we're going to talk about the Watergate scandal, which maybe you've heard that term before, but you're not quite sure what it means. Maybe you do know what it means. But we're going to talk a little bit about that. Nixon was president during a really transformative time in our country's history, and his presidency has gone down as one of the most scandalous in American history. So, with that, let's get going talking about Richard M. Nixon. Richard's dad was a guy named Francis Anthony Nixon. He was the owner and grocer of a gas station. His mom, Hannah Millhouse Nixon, she was a Quaker, had 4 brothers, his wife, Thelma, and he had 2 daughters, Patricia and Julie. He was born in Linda, California, and he grew up in poverty and he helped out his father's grocery store. He also, his family grew oranges. And when Nixon was in office and as he was an older man, he reminisced about his time working in the orange groves and how that really taught him the value of hard work. He was raised in the Quaker religion, and he had 2 brothers who both died from tuberculosis. Keep in mind, this is a long time ago, and I mean not in the scheme of world history, but in terms of medicine and medical treatments. This is a long time ago, so he dealt with tragedy early on in his life. He was an excellent student. He graduated in 1930 at the top of his class, and he went on and got a history degree. After undergrad, he went to Duke Law School, which is one of the better law schools in the country. First, he started just working out as an attorney, and then he decided he wanted to be a businessman. He tried to start a business, but his business never really took. So he closed his business and enlisted in the Navy for World War II. In World War II, eventually he made it to the rank of lieutenant commander, but he resigned in 1946 and took office as a U.S. representative in 1947. So he was a House member. And he does that for 3 years. And in 1950, he's elected to the Senate. And he's in that seat for 2 years. Then he was VP elect on the Republican ticket with Dwight Eisenhower. So Nixon's first time in the White House was spent as vice president. In 1960, he lost the election to John F. Kennedy. One thing we're going to talk about, it actually has its own standard in the Georgia history standards, but it's the impact of television. There was a very, very famous debate between Nixon and Kennedy. and it's pointed to as an example of how television really changed the shape, changed the nature of political debate. Uh, so lost that first election to Kennedy. As vice president for 2 terms, lost his first attempt at the presidency. He also lost a gubernatorial race, so a race to be governor. And he had this famous saying. My dad used to say this. He used to say, oh, jokingly, one day you won't have old David to kick around anymore. Nixon famously declared, you won't have Dick Nixon to kick around anymore. There's a shot of that famous debate. Nixon was sweating profusely. In fact, we'll watch a clip of that if we can find it. 1960, see Kennedy won again, or what? Excuse me, that's when Kennedy beat Nixon. But in '68, he's elected president. So, in spite of his decision to no longer run for public office, he changed his mind and he ran for president, the biggest public office of all. Ran against Ronald Reagan, who, of course, is a future Republican president. Basically, it's not important who he ran against, just a bunch of governors. And when he wins the nomination, he chooses the governor of Maryland, a guy named Spiro Agnew, to be his running mate. Agnew's going to go down in his own scandal. Agnew was taking cash bribes for government contracts, but people don't really talk about that because his boss was the president, and he got caught cheating too. So Nixon and Agnew defeat Hubert Humphrey, who had served under Lyndon Johnson. He got 43% of the popular vote. So Nixon won all of the heartland here, all the way out west, with the exception of Washington. There's Spiro Agnew, his VP, one of the shadiest fellows in American political history. He was renominated, as sitting presidents are, and yet again he was going to have Agnew as his running mate. He very easily defeated George McGovern, winning 61% of the vote, 520 electoral votes. So in '68, he didn't even have a majority of the popular vote, but he won. This time he dominated. '73, Agnew was put under investigation. It was revealed he had accepted bribes of over $100,000 while he was Baltimore County Executive, Governor of Maryland, and VP. He was allowed to plead no contest to a single charge of failure to report $29,500 of income acquired in 1967, provided that he resign as VP. So Agnew has to resign because of things he did when he was back in Maryland. Nixon, as Agnew's replacement as vice president, he appoints Gerald Ford. future President Gerald Ford. And Gerald Ford, actually, fun fact, holds the distinction, I think, of being the greatest football player in American presidential history. You can look that up if you care to. So Agnew was the second vice president to resign. John C. Calhoun resigned in 1832. We actually didn't talk about that when we talked early to mid 19th century, but he's the only one to ever resign because of charges of corruption. You can see this is, I think, about as thorough of a victory probably since Washington ran for reelection. The only state won by McGovern was Massachusetts. So yeah, I mean Nixon's margin of victory is as big as we've seen. There's Gerald Ford. Watergate scandal, and we have an entirely different PowerPoint about Watergate that we're going to go over, but let's get acquainted with the facts. So while he was running for reelection, it was revealed that five men from an organization called the Committee to Reelect the President, CREEP, burglarized the Democratic National Headquarters, which was at the Watergate Hotel. Two Washington Post reporters, a guy named Bob Woodward and a guy named Carl Bernstein, um, they helped to unfold this cover up of the break in, and eventually they write what is one of the definitive pieces of American journalism and U.S. history. So Nixon had set up taping system when the Senate asked to hand over the tapes recorded in the Oval Office. He refused to hand them over. He said that he had executive privilege and didn't have to. The Supreme Court rejected that claim and they forced him to give the tapes up. The tapes did not actually implicate the president in the actual crime. So the tapes provided no evidence that Nixon actually did it, but they did catch him talking about the process of covering it up. So that was just about as bad. He knew that impeachment was inevitable, so he resigned. Instead of getting impeached, he resigned on August 9th, 1974, which made him the first and only president to ever resign. When you ask people, how many presidents have been impeached before Trump, pretty common answer is Richard Nixon, because when we hear his name, we hear impeachment alongside it. But he actually resigned before that could happen. His vice president Gerald Ford took over, and that same day gave Nixon a presidential pardon. So he resigns. He's pardoned, and he goes back to San Clemente, California, and kind of goes into hiding for a while. Stays off the radar. He does wind up coming into the public conversation again in 1985. Of all things, it was to resolve a dispute between Major League Baseball and the Umpire Association. He would also get involved in the Reagan administration Remember, Nixon defeated Reagan in a presidential election one time. He died in 1994 at the age of 81 after having a stroke. Nixon's era was full of significant events. Vietnam ended. His visit to the People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union were major episodes. The United States landed on the moon. But when people hear Nixon, not all, but I think it's most people think scandal. That caused the trust in the office of presidency to be diminished. So, some of the things going on during Nixon's presidency. On July 20th, 1969, Apollo 11 reached the moon, and the first step by man was taken outside of Earth. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. This accomplished Kennedy's objective of going to the moon before close of decade. You know what? Instead of reading that out, I'm going to find us a clip of the Kennedy Nixon debates. So this is September 1960. And this is John F. Kennedy debating Richard Nixon. Here's Kennedy over here. It's a dapper fellow. Here's Nixon. And the idea that, one of the reasons this is important, well, not only was it a debate of two presidential candidates during a really tumultuous time, it was the first televised debate. So it's, like I mentioned earlier, it's pointed to as being prime illustration of how you come across on television suddenly was just as important as the words you were saying, because people naturally will lend their support. They'll be more likely to lend their support to someone who they find impressive when he's on television. So let's watch some of this.
Television and radio stations of the United States and their affiliated stations are proud to provide facilities for a discussion of issues in the current political campaign by the two major candidates for the presidency. The candidates need no introduction. The Republican candidate, Vice President Richard M. Nixon, and the Democratic candidate, Senator John F. Kennedy. According to rules set by the candidates themselves, each man shall make an opening statement of approximately 8 minutes duration and a closing statement of approximately 3 minutes duration. In between, the candidates will answer or comment upon answers to questions put by a panel of correspondents. In this, the first discussion in a series of 4 joint appearances, the subject matter has been agreed will be restricted to internal or domestic American matters. And now for the first opening statement by Senator John F. Kennedy.
Nixon. In the election of 1860, Abraham Lincoln said the question was whether this nation could exist, half slave or half free. In the election of 1960, and with the world around us, the question is whether the world will exist, half slave or half free, whether it will move in the direction of freedom, in the direction of the road that we are taking, or whether it will move in the direction of slavery. I think it will depend in great measure upon what we do here in the United States, that we build, on the kind of strength that we maintain. We discussed tonight domestic issues, but I would not want that to be any implication to be given that this does not involve directly our struggle with Mr. Khrushchev for survival. Mr. Khrushchev is in New York, and he maintains the communist offensive throughout the world. because of the productive power of the Soviet Union itself. The Chinese communists have always had a large population, but they are important and dangerous now because they are mounting a major effort within their own country. The kind of country we have here, the kind of society we have, the kind of strength we build in the United States will be the defense of freedom. If we do well here, if we meet our obligations, if we're moving ahead, then I think freedom will be secure around the world. If we fail, then freedom fails. Therefore, I think the question before the American people is, are we doing as much as we can do? Are we as strong as we should be? Are we as strong as we must be if we're going to maintain our independence? And if we're going
to skip ahead.
In great measure.
We're going to skip ahead so we can hear Nixon.
The reason Franklin Roosevelt was a good neighbor in Latin America was because he was a good neighbor in the United States. Because they felt that the American society was moving again. I want us to recapture that image. I want people in Latin America and Africa and Asia to start to look to America, to see how we're doing things, to wonder what the President of the United States is doing, and not to look at Khrushchev or look at the Chinese communists. That is the obligation upon our generation. In 1933, Franklin Roosevelt said in his inaugural that this generation of Americans has a rendezvous with destiny. I think our generation of Americans has the same rendezvous. Them Nixon.
Smith, Senator Kennedy. The things that Senator Kennedy has said, many of us can agree with. There is no question but that we cannot discuss our internal affairs in the United States without recognizing that they have a tremendous bearing on our international position. There is no question but that this nation cannot stand still because we are in a deadly competition. A competition not only with the men in the Kremlin, but the men in Peking. We're ahead in this competition, as Senator Kennedy, I think, has implied. But when you're in a race, the only way to stay ahead is to move ahead. And I subscribe completely to the spirit that Senator Kennedy has expressed tonight, the spirit that the United States should move ahead. Where then do we disagree? I think we disagree on the implication of his remarks tonight and on the statements that he has made on many occasions during his campaign to the effect that the United States has been standing still. We heard tonight, for example, the statement made that our growth in national product last year was the lowest of any industrial.
So the main takeaway for a lot of America was that Nixon here seemed stiff and lacked charisma, whereas Kennedy came across as handsome and charming and charismatic. It's also said that Kennedy sort of played a trick on Nixon, and he got word out to Nixon that no, he was not wearing makeup. Kennedy was not going to wear makeup since they were, even though they were being on television, and sort of word of that got around. And Nixon didn't want to, be wearing makeup if Kennedy wasn't. And then Kennedy went and, suited up and got all the makeup on anyway. So anyway, can't underestimate the impact of television. We'll talk more about that in the next week or so. So, guys, you're really on the home stretch. I think for some of you, the end of the school year is just a week or so away. But stick with it in the meantime. Keep turning in your assignments. And I will talk to you guys tomorrow.